Good afternoon. Welcome. Hi, sorry to interrupt your catching up with friends. I'm Eric Hansen, the music director of the orchestra and conductor. And for the benefit of those of you who are newbies, I talk briefly before each concert, and starting, of course, with this first concert of the year, and try to give you a little bit of insight into the kind of music we do, and certainly into the composers' lives, and what, if not what made them write the piece, so much as the way they operated, and how things, if there are any connections between the pieces that we do. Because, for instance, some of our programs, we will have music from the Baroque era, not too often because we have a full symphony orchestra, and I like to keep the brass and all the woodwinds busy. And in Bach's time and Telemann, Vivaldi, there are not a lot of works for full orchestra. Everything tends to be relatively small in the winds, usually with just oboes and bassoons. Once in a while, horns and trumpets and timpani if it's a ceremonial piece, typically a sacred work. But as I said, once in a while we will pair. I'll pair when I'm choosing music repertoire for the season, music that's from several hundred years distant. In other words, a Baroque piece, let's say from the early 1700s with some late 19th or 20th century music, once in a while 21st. In the instance of this particular program, there happens to be kind of a happy coincidence that oddly enough, it didn't occur to me until I had chosen the program for the whole season. And that is that the music, all three of the pieces that we're doing on this program are all instrumental music. In other words, non-vocal, non-dance per se. In other words, not accompaniment music. Nevertheless, it's from, all three pieces are from either an opera or from what's called incidental music to a play. So I want to talk a little bit about that because it's something that I'm sure all of you are aware of, that orchestras and instrumentalists, in other words, non-vocal musicians, frequently accompany a whole wide variety of different aspects that occur not just in the theater, but also in different forms of music. So for instance, of course, there's music to support ballets, for dance, specifically for dance that composers will have written that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. There's certainly music for plays. That's probably, well, of course, prehistory, of course, people sang for the seasons and rites of passage and et cetera, thousands and thousands of years ago. But we have a fair amount of documentation historically of quite a few of the Greek playwrights around 2,500 years ago, around 400, 500, 600 BC, who not only wrote, such as Sophocles, who wrote not only plays, but actually composed music to be performed before the performance of the play, and in different specific places during the course of the play, certainly as what's called entr'acte music, which is between scenes. When the curtain goes down at the opera and scenes change, there typically the orchestra plays music, and at that time, even 2,500 years ago, a number of the playwrights wrote their own music. Of course, their instruments are very different than the ones that we have here, and in small numbers. But even at that time, there were lutes, ancient ones, clearly not as advanced as the lute that was active in the High Renaissance and into the Baroque era in Bach's life, let alone something like an instrument like the guitar. And of course, there were no bows at the time. They were all plucked or strummed, but there were woodwind instruments, and in fact, reed instruments. The olos, the time of Sophocles, was an instrument that had like a tube, like woodwind instruments, that had a reed that vibrated, that produced probably kind of a bagpipe or kind of a nasally sound. So, of course, the music we're doing is in a fairly narrow time frame. Again, it just was happenstance. So the earliest piece is the overture that we're doing by Verdi is from 1845, And the most recent piece is 1905, the incidental music to the play Pelléas and Mélisande. So I don't know how many of you know what the word opera means. And I'm sorry, I'm going to my lecture mode. But the interesting thing about it is it's not what you think. Opera is the plural of opus. And for those of you who've been around and remember the cartoon, it's not a funny little penguin. Breathed. In any case, opus means work, like a composition, something that you created. So, for instance, Beethoven composed something along the lines of 100, close to 140 works, and 135 of them have opus numbers. And most composers, their works are in order of opus 1, opus 2, opus 3, which necessarily corresponds with when the piece was published or composed, depending. And so opera is the plural of this. So when you go to the opera, just be aware of the title is actually kind of apt, because when you think about it, even though you have a storyline in opera, just as like you do in a movie, which of course another form of music which tends to use orchestra music, depending upon if it's, the Lord of the Rings or sci-fi or even just an action drama. Frequently there's orchestra music in the background. And so an opera is composed of a series, several dozen, sometimes as many as 34 or 40 separate pieces that are nevertheless like a necklace, kind of all strung together. And the individual structures of them, it's kind of beside the point. I don't want to lecture too much, but of course you'll have an aria, again, the Italian word for air, not like oxygen, but an air meaning a song, A-I-R in English. And that's a solo for an individual, a woman or a man, or a pants role in Mozart, meaning a woman who's singing the role of a man, or a boy, I should say. And the orchestra accompanies, or you have duets or small ensembles all the way up to choruses, and then you have purely instrumental music. So that's a long way of me explaining that everything that we're doing on the program is individual pieces taken from either the incidental music to a play or from the opera that are purely instrumental, non-vocal, in other words. And I'll talk a little bit more, although not at great length, before each of the pieces that we perform, because I like to introduce them as well when the full audience is here. I did want to mention, I'll come back to the pieces in a second, that this is an important season for us because we're celebrating our 60th anniversary. And I have to tell you something on a personal note. There's a kind of a scary sidebar to this, which is not scary for you, but it's scary for me, because I played in the very first season of this orchestra 60 years ago. And I had a little bit more up here, and it was a different color. The hair, I didn't conduct at that time. The conductor who founded the orchestra, Randy Hunt, as he was known by everyone, was a fantastic musician, a tremendous conductor, and also the father of a very famous Baroque singer who was absolutely spectacular. So he started the orchestra, and it was kind of based in different places, oddly enough at Merritt College, where we rehearse, although in a different location, which I won't go into the geography. But the orchestra's been around. It's a quite old orchestra, as community orchestras go, and it's been going pretty full blast since then. I'm I think the fifth conductor of the orchestra, so most of the conductors that have conducted it have had it for a number of years, and all the conductors who preceded me were superb musicians and excellent conductors. It's been an honor for me to work with the group now. I've lost track. I'm either in my 26th or 27th year. But back to the music, I just wanted to mention a couple of other things. The overture that we're doing is the overture to Joan of Arc, Giovanna d'Arco by Verdi. This was his seventh opera, and if you do not know, Verdi was one of the most, in the 400 or so plus, actually about 430 years of the history of opera, because the earliest operas are basically the last decade before the 17th century, the 1590s. But operas have been around for a very, very long time, but very few composers have been as prolific and had such an incredibly long, dramatic career as Giuseppe Verdi, who composed his first opera in 1839 and his last nearly 55 years later. And what's really curious, for those of you who know about creative people, or even people who are great scientists or mathematicians, it appears, this is a sweeping trajectory, that the chronological kind of sweep of most of our creative, either artists or mathematicians or scientists, or in many fields, tends to be not so much when they're very, very young, but fairly early they get going. And it's not that they burn out, but they tend to have their greatest works after 10, 15, 20 years. Verdi's, many of his operas are spectacular and performed regularly, including the earliest, but his two greatest are considered to be Otello and Falstaff. He wrote in his 80s. He was a master of the art form of drama in opera. This is his 7th of 26 operas that he composed, Giovanna d'Arco. And it's, you can tell from the overture, because his overtures are very, very, very dramatic and exciting. This is a compelling story you're about to listen to, even though everybody knows this, most people know the story of Joan of Arc. Then the second piece on the program is the incidental music to Pelléas and Mélisande, I should say Pelléas et Mélisande, by the great Finnish composer Jean Sibelius. And he composed, he was very prolific. He wrote hundreds of works, also lived a very long, fruitful life, composed really throughout the entire first half of the 20th century, and composed very quickly, and everything he wrote is a very popular, very spectacular piece. Some pieces more popular than others. And he composed 6 or 7 sets of what's called incidental music. And I had mentioned when I first started my notes that incidental music is this just kind of generic term for anywhere from 2 or 3 short 2 or 3 minute pieces of mostly instrumental music that are interspersed throughout the play, starting before it, maybe an intermission between the acts for practical purposes, so actors can leave the stage, other actors come on, sets, also entr'acte, meaning, as I said, between acts, is a standard 19th century term. In this instance, he composed actually 10 pieces for this play, including music to be performed in the play by Maeterlinck from the late 19th century. And by the way, basically a retelling, if you will, of Romeo and Juliet. So you know, like a lot of dramas, most of the characters end up dead. And we'll be performing several 5 or 6 movements from this, as you see listed in your program. And it's very compelling. Sibelius is very dramatic, as was Verdi and Berlioz. And then the last piece is by Berlioz. It's music from the Trojans, Les Troyens, which was Berlioz's final opera. It's still considered one of the great operas. It's very much cherished in France. It's not performed a lot because it's particularly long, and there are a variety of reasons for it. It's very difficult to stage performances of it, not only because it's long, but it's incredibly complicated and uses a huge orchestra, as well as giant chorus and multiple soloists. And it's the retelling, of course, of the Sack of Troy. It's in actually 2 parts. It's almost like watching a mini-series. There are 3 acts on the Sack of Troy, and then 2 acts of the Trojans after the War, the Trojans in Carthage. And we're doing 4, as I mentioned, instrumental works from this that I'll talk again briefly about, that comprise the overture. At least our overture is actually the entr'acte before the 4th act. Sorry, it's too much information, but so you know. And then the second piece, this is kind of a symphony, if you will, a suite, as I titled it, that's done quite often. And then the second portion, movement, if you will, is a Royal Hunt and Storm, that's very dramatic. And Berlioz, who hit the ground running with his Symphonie Fantastique in 1830, just 3 years after Beethoven's death and a half dozen years after Beethoven's ninth, Berlioz created this massive use of the orchestra and took the coloration use of the orchestra to, not to an extreme, but to a place where very few composers after him for 50 or 60 or 70 years got anywhere near. He was a master of incredible strokes of color, big swatches of orchestral color. And you're going to hear this especially in the second movement, because you're going to hear lightning and thunder and explosions. And the nymphs in the opera running around trying to get out of the rain and the storm and everything. Then the third movement is a ballet, which is very typical of 19th century opera, that there will be not so much a formal ballet like the Nutcracker or Swan Lake, but several dances that are referred to as ballet. And in this instance, there are 3 or 4 brief dances that are really beautiful that Berlioz composed. And we're doing the first of these, Ballet 1. And then finally, we're ending with the Trojan March. And Berlioz wrote incredible marches that are very, very dramatic. If you want to hear something really stirring that's exciting, listen to Berlioz's arrangement of La Marseillaise, where he just took it. He had the chorus and soloists do all 5 choruses. So if you like to stand up for national anthems and don't mind listening to a piece that goes on for 15 minutes, you can listen to it. It's incredibly stirring and exciting, and uses the entire orchestra, percussion, cymbals, and the whole bit, and the kitchen sink. So please, without further ado, enjoy the program and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.